The frozen river didn't crack quietly that night. It howled, as if the ice itself were dying. In the merciless winter of 1342, a lone huntress named Mother Dunmore hauled 11 monstrous, frost-covered wolves out of a drowning grave beneath the Blackwater, never once suspecting that the 12th creature, the largest, the most broken, the most dangerous, was not a wolf at all. He was a king. That winter had wrapped itself around the northern borderlands like a fist of iron. In the forgotten settlement of Oakhaven, cold wasn't simply weather. It was a predator in its own right, gnawing through wood, flesh, and hope alike. The forest stood frozen mid-breath, branches sheathed in glassy ice, groaning beneath gusts that came screaming down from the mountains. For Mother Dunmore, though, brutal weather was nothing new. It was simply one more enemy in a life spent fighting to stay alive. She was 24, the final surviving member of her family, and she lived alone in a weathered stone cottage, perched near the treacherous drop of Blackwater Gorge. Her father had once been one of the finest huntsmen never to serve the great lords, until a shift in political favor stripped their name of honor and sent him into exile, where he eventually died. From him, Mother had inherited more than sharp instincts and the mastery of the wild. She'd inherited an unbreakable will. She scraped by bartering hard-won roots and cured furs in the distant village of Kell, though she kept her words as few and guarded as her trust. The villagers murmured that she was more forest spirit than woman, too feral, too untamed to belong among them. On a merciless Tuesday evening, as the sun bled out behind the mountain ridge, Mother was fastening the storm shutters against the coming dark when the wind carried something strange to her. The metallic bite of blood tangled with a sharp, electric tang like lightning about to strike. Then came the sound. It wasn't a wolf's cry. It wasn't the yip of some wandering coyote. It was a deep, bone-shaking wail of agony, muffled beneath ice and drowning water, a chorus of suffering that rattled straight through her boots and into her spine. Mother went rigid, her sharp amber gaze cutting toward the source, Blackwater River, a violent artery of water slicing through the ravine barely a mile from her door. That river was infamous. Its ice looked solid enough to walk across, but underneath, the current had hollowed it out like a trap waiting to be sprung. She didn't hesitate. She snatched her father's old logging ropes, a set of iron-hooked poles, and her skinning blade, threw her wool cloak over her shoulders, and tore off into the blinding snow, chasing the sound of dying creatures. When she reached the edge of the ravine, what she saw stole the breath from her lungs. The ice covering the deepest stretch of river had given way completely, and the pack of wolves was drowning in the churning black slush below. But as she scrambled down the embankment, she realized these were no ordinary beasts. They were enormous, towering, ancient-looking things, 3 times the size of any wolf she'd ever crossed paths with. Their shoulders were broad as war horses, their coats black as a moonless sky. The current was dragging them under the remaining ice, threatening to seal them beneath it within minutes. Several were already clawing at the slick edges, their cries slicing through the storm. "Hang on," Mother breathed to herself, letting instinct override terror. If she paused to consider the madness of wading toward 12 giant predators, she'd never move at all. She lashed her rope around the trunk of a massive old oak, tied the other end at her waist, and stepped out onto the crumbling riverbank. The first wolf she reached was an enormous ash-grey beast, thrashing in blind panic, its strange violet eyes wide with terror. She looped a second rope around its chest and cinched it tight. "Pull!" She screamed into the wind, throwing her whole body against the anchor line. Her muscles caught fire instantly. The animal had to weigh 600 pounds, soaked through with freezing water. She dug her boots into the frost-hardened ground, her gloves splitting against her blistering palms as she hauled with everything she had. With one final, agonized pull, the grey wolf collapsed onto the muddy bank, choking up river water. It didn't attack. It simply lay there, trembling, watching her with an intelligence far too knowing for an animal. There was no time to dwell on it. She threw herself back toward the water, one after another. She repeated the brutal cycle. A silver-coated female came next, dragged out by the scruff, her back legs nearly useless from the cold. then to jet black males, tangled together beneath the surface. She had to pry them apart with the iron pole before hauling both out at once, nearly wrenching her shoulder from its socket in the process. By the seventh rescue, her breath was tearing ragged from her chest. The skin on her hands had split open, painting the rope with her own blood. By the 11th, a massive, battle-scarred brute who looked like he'd survived 100 wars. Mother was running purely on adrenaline, her vision narrowing at the edges, her soaked clothes freezing to her skin. When the 11th wolf finally crawled free, it joined the others. The pack didn't scatter and didn't attack. Instead, they gathered into a silent, shivering half-circle, their glowing eyes fixed on the exhausted woman who had just pulled every one of them from death. Mava sank to her knees, chest heaving, believing it was finally over. Her hands shook violently, the first signs of hypothermia setting in. She stared out at the black, churning water, ready to gather her ropes and stumble home. That's when the river exploded. A final shape burst upward through the broken ice, and Maeve's heart stopped cold. This wasn't just another wolf. This was something else entirely. He was nearly twice the size of the others, his coat a stunning mix of deep midnight and frost white. But it wasn't his size that froze her in place. It was the fact that he was dying. Buried deep in his shoulder was a massive black iron bolt, its tip gleaming silver, the flesh around it blackened and smoking, as though the metal were burning him from the inside. The water around him bloomed dark with blood. His eyes met hers. They weren't the eyes of a beast. They were a piercing sapphire blue, radiating a crushing sense of command even as the life drained from them. Even dying, he carried the weight of something ancient and proud. He was slipping, his claws losing their grip on the ice. No. The word tore out of Maeve's raw throat. She couldn't watch him go under. Not after everything. Ignoring her screaming muscles, she released herself from the anchor rope and stepped out onto the fractured ice itself, since the tether wouldn't reach far enough. Behind her, the 11 rescued wolves let out a collective, terrified whine. The ice groaned and split beneath her boots as she dropped flat to spread her weight and plunged her bare, bleeding arms into the freezing water. The pain was instant and blinding, like her skin was being flayed from bone. She found his thick fur and tangled her fingers into it. He groaned, a sound that shook her to her core, but he had nothing left. He was dead weight, sinking. "Help me," she screamed, not even sure who she was calling to. Then she felt it, enormous pressure clamping around her waist. The scarred 11th wolf had planted himself on solid ground and seized the trailing end of her rope in his jaws, hauling backward with all his strength. The others joined, gripping the rope in their teeth, becoming a living pulley system. Between their combined strength and Maeve's final desperate pull, the giant was torn free of the river's grip. The ice beneath Mava gave way completely. She dropped into the shallows, but the pack was already moving. The silver female snatched her by the hood and dragged her onto the bank beside their unconscious leader. Mava lay in the snow coughing, her vision dimming at the edges. She recognized the signs of death by cold. Without warmth, and fast, she wouldn't survive the night. But then warmth found her anyway. The 11 wolves formed a tight, living wall around her and their fallen king, their massive bodies blocking the wind, their unnatural body heat pouring over her like a furnace, chasing the violent shivers from her limbs. An hour later, in the shelter of that living fortress, Mava managed to rise. The giant wolf was still unconscious, his breathing shallow, the wound on his shoulder weeping something dark. "We have to get him inside," she whispered. To her astonishment, the pack seemed to understand exactly what she meant. She fetched her heavy logging sled, built for hauling felled oak trunks, and with her ropes, along with 2 of the black wolves pushing with their massive heads, they loaded the giant onto it. The trek back to her cabin was surreal. 1 exhausted woman and 11 legendary creatures moving through the storm in eerie, perfect unison, dragging their dying king home. At the cabin, the pack crowded the porch, forming a windbreak with their bodies. Only the scarred brute and the silver female helped Mava drag the titan inside, where his massive frame swallowed the entire braided rug before her stone hearth. She moved fast, stoking the fire until the room blazed with heat, gathering her father's old surgical tools, jars of dried comfrey and wintergreen, and a rare root her father once called wolfsbane, meant for treating poisoning from cursed metals. The silver embedded in the creature's shoulder reeked of malice. She could smell his flesh burning from where she knelt. "This is going to hurt," she murmured, resting a gentle hand against his massive ear. Gripping the bolt with heavy iron pliers, she straddled his chest to hold him steady, braced herself, and pulled with everything left in her body. Even unconscious, the pain ripped a deafening roar from his throat that rattled every pot hanging in the kitchen. His claws tore deep gouges into her floorboards as he thrashed. She was thrown backward, but refused to let go. With a sickening, wet tear, the bolt finally came free. She held it into the fire, where it hissed and spat. Working quickly, she packed the wound with crushed herbal paste and bound it tightly in clean linen. By the time she finished, she was drenched in sweat, dirt, and his blood. His breathing steadied. The black veins spreading from the wound began to recede as the healing took hold. Outside, the rest of the pack let out a low, rumbling hum of relief that shook the log walls. Utterly spent, Mava collapsed beside the hearth, just inches from the massive white and black wolf, resting her head against his flank, her hand over his slow, steady heartbeat. Sleep took her instantly. Surrounded by a circle of apex predators, hours slipped by. The storm outside raged, then finally quieted, leaving behind a hushed, pristine white world. As dawn's first light crept through the frost-laced windows, Mava began to stir. The familiar scent of wet fur was gone. In its place hung something sharper, copper, ancient pine, and something distinctly male, like leather and ozone. She opened her eyes. She wasn't resting against fur anymore. Her head lay against something solid, warm and smooth. She jolted upright, heart slamming in her chest. The wolves were gone. Her small cabin was packed instead with 11 towering men, standing in a rigid semicircle around her living room, wrapped only in scraps of fur and salvaged blankets, their faces fierce and solemn, heavy with something like reverence. Mava gasped, scrambling backward until the stone heart stopped her retreat. Her eyes flew to the corner bed, where she'd shifted the wounded beast during the night. Lying there, far too large for the small cot, was a man, powerfully built, his chest wide as a shield and marked with old battle scars. His wild black hair streaked white at the temples. Wrapped around his shoulder was the same bloodied linen she had tied there hours earlier. His eyes opened, the same piercing sapphire blue she'd seen beneath the ice. Instantly, all 11 men dropped to one knee, heads bowed in perfect, unsettling unison. The man on the bed studied his bandaged shoulder, then the dried blood staining Maeve's hands, and finally looked directly at her. His voice, when it came, was low and gravelled, carrying a weight that seemed to press against the very air. "You pulled my pack from the jaws of death, little huntress," he said, a faint, dangerous smile tugging at his mouth. "And you dragged the sovereign of the northern brood back from the edge of the grave itself. Tell me, what does a human girl do now, with an alpha king in her debt?" Mava could only stare, breath caught in her throat, as the full weight of what she'd stumbled into began to settle over her. She hadn't simply rescued a pack of animals in the snow. She had reshaped the fate of an entire continent. And there was no going back now. The silence stretched on, heavy as stone against her chest. The 11 men remained frozen in their bow, and the giant on the cot watched her with eyes like the bottom of a frozen sea. The fire crackled to loud in the quiet. Mava pressed herself harder against the cold hearthstone, breath coming fast and shallow. She had survived the wilderness her whole life, but nothing in her father's journals had prepared her for this. "You look at us like we're spirits," the man rumbled, shifting his weight and wincing as the movement pulled at his bandaged shoulder. "I promise you, little huntress, we are flesh and blood, and we owe that to you." Mava forced her voice to work. You were the wolves. I pulled you out of the river." "You did," he agreed, swinging his long legs off the court and rising with the deadly, fluid grace of a predator despite his wounds. "I am Gideon, sovereign of the northern brood. These are my vanguard, my finest warriors, and you, human, have done what entire armies could not. You saved my life. How? Mother whispered, eyes flicking across the scarred, powerful bodies filling her small cabin. Despite the freezing draft leaking through her floorboards, none of them seemed to feel the cold. How did creatures like you end up drowning in the gorge? You could tear a bear in half. A river shouldn't have been able to touch you. Something dark passed over Gideon's face, his sapphire eyes deepening into a stormy navy. He glanced toward the largest of his men. The scarred brute Mother had pulled out 11th, whose chest and face bore the same jagged silver marks as the wolf he'd been. We were not beaten by nature. Mother Dunmore, the scarred man said, his voice like grinding rock. Mother startled. She hadn't told them her name. I am Gareth, he continued. We were driven into that gorge like livestock, hunted by men carrying cowardly weapons, hunters. Mother asked, confused. No trapper from Kel would dare go after wolves your size. They're too afraid of the woods in winter. They weren't trappers. Gideon cut in, his gaze sharp on her. They were mercenaries, well-funded, well-armed. They carried iron ballistas mounted on sleds, firing bolts forged from consecrated silver. The poison burning through my shoulder was made specifically to kill our kind. They cornered us in Whispering Pass and drove us onto that weak ice on purpose. A cold dread settled in Maeve's stomach, who had the wealth and reach to hunt werewolf royalty in the dead of winter. William de Boreham. Gideon spat the name like poison. The Earl of Northampton. The Crown has grown weary of the old treaties that keep our forests out of their reach. They want the timber, the silver mines, the mountain passes, and to take them, they need the northern brood erased. De Boreham bankrolled a private army of silver hunters to slaughter my vanguard and see me dead. Maeve's pulse pounded. She was just a forgotten woman living on the edge of nowhere. And now she stood at the center of a hidden war between the English crown and a supernatural kingdom. She looked down at her hands, still stained with dried blood from hauling wolves out of the ice. If de Boreham's men drove you into that river, her voice cut off as horror dawned on her. She rushed to the frosted window, wiping the glass clear with her sleeve. Outside, the storm had cleared, leaving a blinding stretch of untouched snow. But she wasn't admiring the view. She was staring at the tree line. They won't believe you drowned, she said, her fear snapping instantly into sharp, practical focus. She turned back to face Gideon, her expression hardening into something forged by years of survival. Silver Hunter's track. They'll follow the riverbank. They'll find the broken ice, and they'll find the drag marks my sled left in the snow, leading straight to my front door. A low, unified growl rolled through the 11 men, shaking the very walls. Gideon rose to his full height, towering over her by more than a foot, his sapphire eyes studying her face intently. You have a sharp mind, little huntress, he said. You're right, they're coming, but you need not be afraid. My men will tear through them before a single hair on your head is touched. You're in no shape to fight. Mother shot back, startling even herself with her nerve. Your men are worn thin, half frozen, and probably still carrying silver poisoning from that river. If you shift back into wolves, that residue could stop your hearts. Gareth stepped forward, nodding grimly. She speaks true, my king. We cannot shift. The silver has poisoned our wolves. We fight as men, or we don't fight at all. Mother didn't waste another second. The shock had burned away, replaced by cold, practiced calculation. The same instinct that had kept her alive in Oakhaven 4 years. She crossed to the far wall, gripped a heavy iron ring set into the floor, and hauled open a hidden trapdoor to a dark cellar below. Then you'll fight armed, she commanded, pointing into the darkness. My father was Alistair Dunmore. Before his exile, he was master of the hunt for the High Lords. This cellar is full of steel blades and crossbows. Arm yourselves, now. Gideon stared at her, shock, respect, and something hungrier flickering behind his eyes. A low, rough laugh escaped him. Alistair Dunmore's daughter, he murmured, taking in her wild hair and set jaw. Fate has a cruel sense of humor. Vanguard, arm yourselves. We hold this house, The sun had barely crested the sky when the first warning came. The twang of a ballista slicing through the frozen valley, followed by splintering wood as an iron bolt tore straight through the front porch. Inside, the air was pulled tight as a bowstring. Mava crouched beneath the heavy oak table, her father's carved crossbow braced against her shoulder. Around her, the 11 vanguard warriors crouched near the reinforced doors, armed with broadswords and throwing axes from the hidden armory. Gideon stood by the hearth, a battle axe resting easy in one hand, despite his wound, his presence alone thick enough to choke the room. "They're moving through the east tree line," Lyra whispered. "I smell black powder," Gareth growled. "They mean to burn us out. They won't get the chance," Mava said flatly. The whole perimeter's rigged. Outside, boots crunched through snow. At least 30 mercenaries, clad in dark leather and iron, closing in. Their captain raised his sword to give the signal. "Now," Mava breathed, yanking a rope hidden beneath the floor. The snow outside erupted as hidden timber traps snapped shut with brutal force, hoisting men into the air by their ankles or crushing them beneath falling logs. Screams tore through the frozen air. "Vanguard, break them," Gideon roared, and the front doors flew open. 11 werewolf warriors surged out into the snow like a wall of muscle and steel. Even without their true forms, they moved with terrifying speed and strength, tearing through the mercenary line. Gareth's blade shattered iron armor with every swing. Lyra moved like a blur, her twin daggers finding every gap in her enemy's defenses. Mava didn't stay hidden either. She moved to the shattered window, crossbow raised, hands steady. She spotted a mercenary aiming a rifle at Gareth's exposed back and fired without hesitation, driving a steel bolt through the man's shoulder before he could pull the trigger. Then the wall beside her exploded inward. A mercenary had smashed through the side of the cabin with a heavy iron mace, his eyes wild, lunging straight for her. Before she could reload, a shadow blotted out the light. Gideon moved faster than something his size had any right to, dropping his axe and stepping between Mava and the attacker. The mace struck his unwounded chest with a blow that should have shattered bone. He didn't even flinch. He simply seized the man by the throat, lifted him off the ground, and crushed his windpipe before hurling him through the broken window outside. The remaining mercenaries were already breaking, fleeing back into the trees. The battle was over. Gideon crossed the room to her, brushing a strand of hair from her face, then lowered himself to one knee. Behind him, the returning vanguard went still. "You saved my pack," he said. "I offer you my protection, my loyalty, and my crown. Come with me to the Winter Court, Mava. Stand at my side and rule." Mava placed her blood-stained hands over his. "I don't know the first thing about being a queen." Gideon looked up at her, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his scarred face, his sapphire eyes burning with quiet, unshakable devotion. "My fierce little huntress," he murmured. "After what you did to those hunters today, you've already proven you were born for it. The Winter Court will simply have to learn about their new queen." That battle had answered every question she'd carried since the ice first cracked. She belonged with them now, fully, forever. And with a smile, she stepped forward to claim the destiny waiting for her beside the Alpha King.